Welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony. Today I want to talk a little bit more about beer and war history. I've done a couple of videos on beer and war in the past, and it's because there's so much overlap between the two. You know, pretty much throughout time, throughout history, throughout conflict, anytime there's soldiers in any capacity or any nation, they oftentimes want to have a little bit of a drink. So today, I'm going to talk about how far the logistical chains and the commanders were willing to go to be able to get beer to the front lines, to their soldiers in World War II post D-Day. I want to talk about the World War II beer bombers. Following the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, Allied nations of the UK, of America, of Canada, they found themselves off the beaches into actual mainland France. It was taking a pretty significant toll on logistic chains as well as the morale of the soldiers, and many of them wanted to find a little bit of a good drink, you know, to kind of lift their spirits, so to say. But oftentimes in this region that had been kind of decimated by war, harvests weren't in full effect, so they weren't finding beer and spirits like they wanted to. Instead, they were largely only finding very, very weak ciders that just didn't hit the spot. Fortunately for all the Allied forces, the UK refused to send their soldiers to the front lines without a good, hearty beer, and they had to figure out some type of logistical chain, some solution to this problem to be able to get that beer to the front lines, to keep morale up, to keep the push strong. If the logistical chains weren't set up to be able to bring it over by boat at this exact moment, they were just going to fly it over. And I don't mean fly it over in the sense that they were actually going to like load up big cargo plane full of beer, fly it to the front lines. Nah, they were going to drop it like a bomb. The Royal Air Force worked with the Henty and Constable Brewery back home in the UK to provide free beers to the boys on the front line. Working with the Royal Air Force, Henty and Constable would steam clean airplane fuel tanks and fill them with beer. They would then affix these beer-filled fuel tanks to the British Spitfires, have them fly over the channel into France and be able to drop them just like a bomb into the front lines where soldiers were eagerly awaiting them.
To be fair, the original plan was to land planes on captured airstrips and deliver the beer that way. However, after several incidents of nearly losing pilots and planes in these missions, the Royal Air Force began stress testing barrels where they learned they could be dropped from the skies, allowing the beer drops to continue with the modified XXX depth charges, as they became affectionately known.
The British, always witty in their nomenclature, started calling these modified Spitfire bombs as flying pubs. Each tank was able to hold up to 45 gallons worth of beer. That's a pretty good size, you know. That would keep a battalion afloat for about a day or so. Additionally, the beer was actually rather chilled. It was rather cooled thanks to the high flying altitudes and the colder weather temperatures going on at that time. So when they did impact the ground, people were able to crack them open immediately and start consuming some suds. There was only a couple of downsides. One being that, you know, there had to be tons of runs to be able to continuously provide units with beer. So it wasn't like something that they would constantly have with them. It was basically they'd get a drop, they'd chug a few, and then they'd have to wait for the next one to come in days, weeks, however long it took. Secondly, the metallic walls of the fuel tanks weren't designed to actually hold consumable liquids, right? They were for fuel. So a lot of the metallic taste actually kind of leached into the overall beer. So the flavor wasn't great. And if they didn't clean it well enough, if the steam cleaning process didn't get rid of all the no beer pun intended fusel flavors, then they would wind up with a very difficult, maybe poisonous drink. Which, I mean, I guess if, you know, any day could be your last on the front lines of the Allied invasion of France, I mean, shit, you gotta take what you get, right? The off taste, as awful as they sound, really didn't hinder demand for the continued flying pub beer drop operation. In fact, the demand was so high that the Royal Air Force actually started fitting larger planes or larger tanks, heavy enough to be able to provide continued a bit of a longer supply of beer to the front lines. However, there was a little bit of a problem with these bulk supplies because apparently these larger batches were affixed to the Royal Air Force's Typhoon plane. Apparently looked very similar to the German Focke-Wulf. There was even one case of possible fratricide where an American plane did not recognize the Typhoon and actually started to engage it. It had to drop its beer tanks into the English Channel to be able to improve its evasive maneuvers to escape the friendly fire incident. And speaking of the Americans, they reportedly joined in on the action as well, modifying some of their planes too. However, their program was rather short-lived because the United States' commanders didn't really like the fact that their soldiers were getting drunk or drinking too much beer or whatever. So they ended up kind of not scrapping the plan, but redesigning it to drop ice cream instead, which thanks to those cold altitude temperatures and the drop, they were able to kind of remain sustained. Unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end, and the whole beer bomber drop program came to its natural conclusion for a variety of reasons. Primarily, reason number one being that as the Allied forces continued to make push into France, they were able to establish more refined logistical chains. They were able to bring those types of supplies, beer or ice cream or whatever, to the front lines much more efficiently through roads or rail networks. Secondly, the overall war effort on an industrial scale took so much of a toll that many breweries actually became retrofit to be able to create machinery and different types of mechanical aspects for war equipment, and they weren't able to have the bulk supply amount of beer for the front line that they would be able to sustain at home operations, which were still relatively important to be able to keep the home population kind of docile, kind of keep their heads cool. That combined with severe rationing and all the different cuts that had to been implemented, so many adjuncts were put into beer at this point in time in the UK and the US that it just became a little bit infeasible for the beer run operations to continue. But in the weirdest twist, apparently the breweries in the US and UK who were feeding this program were actually kind of challenged by tax revenue agencies. Apparently, they were facing steep fines for illegally importing or exporting beer from the UK to France, which at that point in time was still considered a Nazi territory. So it would have broken all different types of trade agreements and arrangements and things like that. So that's definitely the weirdest out of the reasons. Regardless, the operation was seen as a large success. Morale is one of the most important things of any battle, right? Morale wins wars. It's a commonly said phrase because it does. And I know for a fact that if I was on the front lines and I saw a plane coming and dropping really anything other than a bomb on me, but especially beer, I would be happy. But that's one of those little weird convergences between beer and military history that don't get talked about often enough. It's so amazing the amount of overlap and the stories that come out of those the collision of those two worlds. So I hope you learned a little something about both beer and military war history, and I hope you enjoyed. So thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. Remember, there's a story in every bottle and that life is beautiful. Cheers.